The conventional story is that the British came to Bharat. It was an uncivilized, savage nation. Terrible, terrible people, demonic practices. Their deities were devilish. They practiced the most horrific social and cultural discriminations. And the white Christian Anglicans came and descended upon us, bringing their white savior skill set and their toolkit. And they tried to do the best to make us into proper human beings. Remember that at that time, personhood was not granted to people who were non-white, non-Christian. They were deemed to be members of the animal kingdom, part of fauna and flora. Persona non grata means that the status of personhood hasn't been granted. And so this is the perspective that they like to say, that they came and they civilized us. And it cost us $45 million, but that's another story. And it cost us over 100 million lives lost to the nation civilization. But the story is that they came for our benefit, civilized us. And then it got to a particular point where they felt that their job of making us into human beings was done, that they wanted to leave. I was reading some of the records and the letters and the correspondence of that time, and Churchill, Elphinstone, the other lords who were creating this partition, this exit strategy, shall we say, they emphasized that the new government in India must accept to be part of the Commonwealth. Okay? Because if Bharat had said, we don't want to be part of anything to do with you people, you are violent, nasty people. Right? We are free that you're gone and we don't want to be a member of your club of any other ex-slaved colonies, then it would have been a different story. But Nehru was impressed, it was impressed upon him that Bharat must become part of a Commonwealth, because that then allowed the British to maintain the moral high ground. They had colonized the moral high ground before they colonized the actual physical ground of many nations. And that would allow them to maintain that moral high ground. And so what actually happened was they got to that point and wove the story that these savages, there are these Hindu savages, and there are these wonderful peace-loving Muslim minority. And the Hindus will descend upon them and wreak havoc to such a degree that in order to save lives, the humanitarian thing that we have to do is create a new nation, a safe nation. Now, anybody who's a student of history will know that there is a myth. In fact, there have been books written about the myth of Christian persecution, how it was such an effective strategy where they would inflict violence and then claim to be the persecuted themselves. It's a strategy. And Goebbels himself, Hitler's master of propaganda, he also said, accuse the others of your own guilty actions as part of strategy. And so they created this idea that the Hindus were a terrible people who were going to do this mass genocide. And then what they actually did was an act of unspeakable, horrific violence, which even to this date, most Hindus have not understood it for what it was. So just imagine, we had wave after wave of enslavers who came across the Khyber Pass and the northwest frontier. And their intention was to steal, was to rob, was to kill, and to inflict genocide. This was their intention, and they did it as a service to their God, as had been told to them to do and justified to them to do by their clerics. And these are the people who'd been attacking the Bharatiya civilization for over a millennia. They'd wanted the lands, we had fought back. They'd wanted the assets, civilizational assets and the wealth, we had fought back. And what the British did when they left is they actually handed that civilization, that identity, that ideology, which had been wreaking havoc upon us, the British gave to them the lands that we had been defending for a millennia. They gifted the Indus Valley, the Saraswati Valley civilization, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, all of these. That's where our civilization was born. Those are the roots, the river civilization. And the British gifted what we had been fighting for and just handed it over to this ideology, which at its roots says that we do not have the right to exist because we are kufr. They gave that over. In the process, a huge swathe of Hindus who lived and whose civilizational assets mounted to billions of dollars worth of just pure raw wealth and land, they just handed it over and deprived the Hindus of home and hearth, their ancestral lands, and arranged for them to leave those lands. It was ethnic cleansing, right? It was, remember, in the Hindu side, on the Hindu side, there was no requirement that the Muslims should leave Bharat. Okay, and yet on the other side, there was a necessity for the Hindus to leave because Pak means pure, purified. It was a land which was going to be purified of infidels. And so the British created what I call killing fields. They created the killing fields where Hindus were massacred in their millions, tens of millions. And that has not yet been fully accounted for. This is what they did. And Hitler, I remember reading one of his letters. Lord Mountbatten had a meeting with Hitler. With Churchill. I'm sorry, these terrorists, they're much of a muchness. Lord Mountbatten had a meeting with Churchill before he left for India. And in that meeting, Mountbatten started to speak about his strategy. And Churchill interrupted him. And he said, and this is recorded, he said, "I don't care what you do, so long as not a single hair on the head of a single Muslim be harmed." Okay, that was Churchill's instruction to Lord Mountbatten. And it's probably worth our viewers knowing that in the British military services, Mountbatten was called the Master of Disaster. That was his title. His unofficial title was Lord Mountbatten is the Master of Disaster. And so they sent the Master of Disaster to implement the ethnic cleansing of Hindus from their ancestral homeland, which is now called Pakistan. The bifurcation was done on that border by a person, Radcliffe, who had never been to Bharat. And if you have a look at the degree of mischief in how that line was drawn, Nankana Sahib, the Gurdwara, which is associated with Guru Nanak's birth, they deliberately drew a line to keep that in Pakistan and separate it from the Sikh community in Punjab. It was an act of mischief and violence repeated again and again and again. So the partition should not be called partition because partition implies an equality on both sides of what is being separated. The intention is to have some sort of equitable partition, and that's not what was done. What was done, as you rightly said, was a dismemberment. It was a civilizational slash and run, and it was done in a manner which was intended to harm as many Hindus as possible in the process, but to leave an environment where Hindus would continue to be harmed after the British had withdrawn. And the evidence is visible. The evidence is visible in the fact that there were 23% of the Pakistani population were Hindus in 47, and now they're down to less than 1%. And yet, the Times newspaper in the United Kingdom yesterday published an article which says that Modi has created an environment in which the Muslims in India are now vulnerable and are attacked. Okay? No mention of what's happened to the Hindus of Pakistan. No mention of the 45 million Hindus who have disappeared from the population in Bangladesh. No mention of Direct Action Day. No mention of the reality of what was inflicted upon Bharat. So when I look at 1947, there is a relief from one point of view in that at least the physical presence of our slave masters, right? Colonialism is another one of those fancy words, when really what was done was the indigenous population were enslaved and their ancestral resources were stolen and squirreled away and brought back into Europe. It was done by the British, it was done by the Dutch, it was done by the French, etc., etc. But the British were the ones who did this with an efficiency which is perhaps only ever seen by a person who performs autopsies. It was such a violent act that was inflicted. And so I'm torn between a sense of relief that at least the physical presence, that stopped. But the manner in which they left affairs afterwards was equally cunning. What they did is they left the Indian National Congress Party was actually the seed. It was a Trojan horse, in the same way that the Greeks left the gift of a Trojan horse and then went and everybody thought that they had disappeared and the battle was over. The Indian National Congress was in fact a Trojan horse. And if you have a look at the manner in which the current leadership of the National Congress have conducted themselves for 70 years, you can see that their decisions were actually a continuation of anti-Hindu policies that were bequeathed to them by a departing anti-Hindu Christian enslavement civilization. They were enslavers. And it's been continuing until the current government came into power. So there's a bit of celebration in that at least we had the opportunity to try and stand up. It took another 50 plus years before we actually managed to get leadership in place who were in tune and in harmony with the civilizational vibration of the Bharatiya people. And this is something that the colonialist enslaving powers finding it very, very difficult to stomach. Remember, we're talking about Christianity and Islam, the religions of the book. Their history, sadly, is that minorities have not prospered in areas where they control the state. Pakistan's Hindus we've spoken about. Saudi, once upon a time, had a very thriving non-Muslim population. Its history was in that manner. And yet, the state does not give equality to Hindus in any of the Middle Eastern countries, with the exception possibly of Israel. And so what we were left with was the hard work of overcoming the best part of 1,200 years of trauma with 200 years of unbelievable, unspeakable genocidal, ethnocidal activities by the British. And we then had the opportunity to say, right, now at least we have a breathing space. And so this thing called partition, it's not finished business yet. At the moment, the game is still underway. The strategy that was implemented in 47 is still being acted upon and largely not noticed by the majority of our Bharatiya community. The penal code that the British left, it discriminates against Hindus. The mandirs, they're paying a tax. We are living as Hindus in Bharat under conditions of religious apartheid. State-sponsored religious apartheid is actually the description for the circumstances in which Hindus are living even today. We are seeing an unequal application of the law. All of these things have yet to be dealt with. And slowly and steadily, they are being dealt with. The one thing that we can do, and the one thing that's vital, is that the Hindu community needs to learn how to articulate consensus. It needs to be able to come together and say, we are the indigenous people of this land, right? Our history, the sacrifices of our ancestors are etched into the stone and into the soil, into the trees and the land itself. And we have a right for our voice to be the dominant voice in this country. And nobody else needs to fear, because they never have done. They have never needed to fear. And that's what we're asserting. I would say that until the genuine principles of democracy, which is the rule of law by the majority, democratically articulated, becomes the rule in Bharat, we still haven't achieved our freedom from enslavement on all levels. Slowly, we're reclawing part of our continent, the physical continent, but also the continent of knowledge, the continent of history, the continent of language, all of those that were colonized, we're slowly beginning to work our way through and reclaim what really belongs to the Bharatiya civilization. When we have complete equality and we have uniform civil code, all of the things that a democratic majority would create, and we have the establishment of not a democracy, but a dharmocracy, a Hindu Rashtra, then and only then will our decolonization and truly our independence from slavery be a reality.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.